Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it gives me the warmest pleasure to welcome you to the opening session of the World Economic Forum Africa for 2009. My name is Lerato Mbele. I'm a senior business anchor with the International Business Network, CNBC Africa. Now, the brainstorming session's been designed to help us, to help you, the leaders in business, politics, and civil society in Africa, to identify the changes, the challenges, and the opportunities that exist in Africa in 2009. These issues that you identify as changes that we need to pursue, challenges we need to address, opportunities we can seize on, will be merged into the broader theme of the World Economic Forum, which is the implications of the global financial crisis for Africa. Now, as you well know, the subprime crisis in the United States, the collapse of Wall Street companies, exposed structural problems within the US and European economies. It's exposed the lack of regulation, and it's exposed the insipid issue of corporate greed. The consequences for the rest of the world, and indeed Africa, has been problems of liquidity in accessing credit for business on the continent. It's estimated that foreign direct investment globally has dropped by 75%, and we know that mergers and acquisition activity in general has dropped by 50%. For a burgeoning private sector in Africa, these are dire consequences in terms of international exposure, in terms of credit flows, in terms of portfolio inflows. There are implications for you. But broadly speaking, there are implications for Africa's poor. People who, for the most part, have been jobless, have had a lack of education, have been exposed to social malaise and conflict, to diseases, HIV, of which the highest infection rates are, unfortunately, here in South Africa, malaria, cholera, and just basic access to social goods. We are hoping that in your deliberations at the World Economic Forum, you're going to find a place, a resonance with general social issues, with public opinion, and factor it into the broader political and economic debates that you'll be entering into. In that regard, what we've done regarding the brainstorming session is to solicit views from the public in order that public opinion can inform general business, corporate, and economic concerns at the forum. Over 2 weeks ago, we asked the public to make their submissions. We had an overwhelmingly positive response. 2,000 participated via internet, and a few hundred participated via YouTube and webcam. At this juncture, I'd like for us to get a sense of public opinion by looking at the YouTube submissions. I must apologize for the sound quality. One of the issues we'll be discussing is technology, so you can help us improve that one.
But we are also interested in why you have voted for a particular challenge. So please upload a short video on YouTube explaining the reasons why.
My name is Temi Dyer Israel Abdullahi, and I'm from Nigeria. I'm a global change maker. I believe that young people have the ability to effect the change that we can believe in, the change that Africa needs. Africa's greatest resources is not oil, mining, or cocoa, or agricultural products. Africa's greatest resources, it's the young people of Africa. We young Africans, we have the potentials, we have the resources, we have the skills and the talent to make Africa great again.
I think the African leaders should focus on skills development as to also keeping the companies generating income and generating skills within the company, so that positions that have higher priority would be filled by people who have more experience in the companies. That should open up opportunities for young people in South Africa to also be part of those successful companies, and would also give them an opportunity to open up more companies, and that will create job employment.
I'm Dennis Hanno, Dean of the Undergraduate School at Babson College in Boston, Massachusetts, USA. And looking at the drivers of change that I think will influence the African continent the most in the coming year, I voted for education and skills development. I believe that this has the potential to have the greatest impact on all of the challenges listed here, both next year and in the future for Africa. Specifically, I believe that entrepreneurship education, the way we teach and practice at Babson, can be both empowering and transformative. Preparing students to be innovative, decisive, and passionate about pursuing economic and social change works. These beliefs can be transformed into action by challenging students to think differently and giving them opportunities, even as students, to put these ideas into action. At Babson, our students take what they learn in our classroom and put it into action by sharing their ideas and knowledge with future leaders in other countries, seen here in Ghana. I've seen the transformative impact that entrepreneurial thought and action has had on our students and the thousands of students they've worked with. Can it work in Africa? Hear for yourself from one of the members of the winning team in Babson's business plan competition this year in Secondary Ghana.
I think we deserve the award because we worked tirelessly. We didn't sleep early last night. We tried working hard. My colleagues and I came together, brought out our ideas, and we think this is the best thing that we've ever done.
Education and skills development. It can drive social and economic change. It's the driver that can have the greatest influence on Africa's future.
My name is Kumuzo Pisani, representing City of South Africa. What I think about the African countries, they should eliminate corruption within the government. One of the main factors that happen in our continent as a whole is that our government failed to lead us in a proper way. People who are corrupted within the government, if they can inspire us enough and lead us by example and show us if we do the right things, we can achieve our goals. Yeah, that's what I want to say.
Hi, I'm Nisha from City of South Africa. And my take on things is that the country and the country's leaders should concentrate on skills development within Africa and also making more opportunities available. Also improving the health systems of Africa and South Africa. Because many people are still out there, they don't get proper health care. So I think if more opportunities are made available for doctors, then the health systems will naturally improve and also improve salaries within the different industries.
Misconception. Misconception is a real problem. And then outside misconception from the international world, even they themselves have some kind of sense of helplessness that they carry around, and also a big misconception about what is outside Africa.
Hi, my name is Yapi Swanepoel and I'm from Cape Town, South Africa. In my opinion, the two biggest challenges facing Africa is a lack of innovation and a lack of entrepreneurship. We have lots of resources, we have people who are keen to do things, but we need to learn how to innovate. And once we've learned how to innovate, we can also learn how to be good entrepreneurs. By and large, in my opinion, Africa is a continent of resellers. We import stuff, we break it down into smaller pieces, we sell it, we break it down into smaller pieces yet again, and we sell it on. We need to learn how to innovate, to improve the lives of the people, and with that innovation, we need to learn how to be good entrepreneurs, to seize the opportunities that are there and use that to better the lives of the citizens of Africa.
I think that what the leaders of Africa should really more focus on the next 12 months, I think, is to sort of like form a Africa which is united. Because I believe that if we have an African state which is divided, then that motivates competition between the countries, and that's not healthy for our growing economy. So I think the leaders should rather pay more attention on working together rather than competing against each other. So that's my view. Yeah.
All right, now that's what our YouTubers felt were important. For anybody who struggled with the sound, I'll just summarize for you. A recurring theme was skills and education, innovation, and entrepreneurship, creating an enabling environment for African entrepreneurs to come to the fore. And also this question of international misconceptions of Africa. As a journalist, I'll take some liability on this one. the role that we play in negatively branding the continent and then filtering into broader questions of unity. If Africans work well together, if regional blocs work well together, it facilitates the channeling of business and transactions. And so that's what the YouTubers feel. As I said to you, the largest proportion of participants made their voices heard via internet. What we did there was to ask people to vote on key concepts that were identified by organizers of the World Economic Forum. Key concepts that we believe best identify and describe perceived challenges and problems in Africa. Those are called tag clouds. The internet participants then voted on them, and the ones with the greatest number of votes were then collated into a bigger tag cloud, as it were, of 50 top drivers of change in Africa, or to simplify it, what have been identified as 50 critical challenges in Africa. And they're broadly classified into 5 or so categories of social issues, technological issues, political issues, economic and financial issues, political and governance problems, and environmental problems as well. That's 5. Okay, my math's not all that good. What we're going to ask you to do is to have a look at these and then cast your vote. But there's the opportunity to add new concepts, new challenges that you believe have been overlooked or misconceived. But firstly, let's have a look at the results from the public opinion survey. Okay, as you can see on the video wall, by virtue of the various categories that have been identified, the key changes, challenges, or opportunities that we're missing out on, or that need to be addressed. In the social sphere, it's the issue of social enterprise. In the technological sphere, it's the question of lower cell phone rates. I think that must be a South African, that one. In the environmental sphere, it's the issue of water management. I know that here alone, we've exhausted something like 90% of our water capacity, and we need to start thinking of ways of recycling. Now, in other countries that are arid because of ecological problems, there isn't even enough water for sanitation, for potable use, let alone industry. In business, it's the issue of infrastructure. It's been estimated by the World Bank that if you can upgrade infrastructure in Africa, it will improve productivity by 40%, and in turn, that will up growth rates by 2%. It's crucial. And in the political arena, it's the perennial problems of corruption and bribery. Is that a misconception, or is it a problem we just cannot get a grip on? That's what the public believes to be important. What is it that you, as business leaders, believe to be important? Now, our task today, at your tables, is for you to review the 50 top drivers of change, the 50 challenges identified by the public, to vote for 3, which we will then discuss broadly. If you believe that there's something that hasn't been represented, reflected on, and you'd like to do so, there is an small oval piece of paper at your table, like that. As a group, add the new challenge, but only one. Submit it, and let's talk about it. What I'd like you to do now is to identify yourselves to your team members at your table. Choose one person to be a team leader who will essentially be, or she will essentially be, a discussant. And after our brainstorm, there will be a report back conducted by your team leader, and we will see whether or not our viewpoints coalesce as people here, and whether or not there's a resonance with public opinion, as you saw there. There's 30 minutes for you to do so. All right, ladies and gentlemen, just to remind you, there's 3 minutes left in your table discussions. 3 minutes left in your table discussions. So please cast your votes for 3 key challenges that you want raised, and it's 3 overall. It's not 3 per category. It's 3 of all 5 categories, plus an additional one if you feel there's something that has not been reflected comprehensively. All right, ladies and gentlemen, time's up. Our ushers will be collecting your votes. Please remember that on the small oval sheet of paper, you must put your table number. It's not necessary for the big 50 drivers of change, but for the new element that you want introduced, please put your table number so that you can just inspire a little bit more discussion and you can tell us what was prompting your thinking. Time's up. I can assure you this was properly audited. Our auditors are right at the back there. They are reliable, reputable officials of the World Economic Forum. It's happening openly and transparently, so it will be properly reflected at the end. Now, what's happened is we've also invited an esteemed group of leaders from various sectors representing the social, the business, the political, and environmental and technological spheres to provide us with insights based on their life's work, their experience in dealing with a broad range of challenges in Africa. I'd like to introduce to you our discussants. I'll just ask them to just put up their hands so that people can see where you're at. Is that fair? We have Dr. Salim Ahmed Salim, whom you all know. He's currently the chairperson of the Mwalimu Julius Nyerere Foundation and formerly the Secretary General of the Organization of African Unity. He's our first discussant. We have Bekele Geleta, who's the Secretary General of the International Federation of the Red Cross and Red Crescent Society, to help give us some sense of perspective on social and humanitarian issues. We also have Dr. Nkosana Moyo, who's the co-chair of the Global Agenda Council and the vice president of the African Development Bank, to help us interrogate some of the economic and business issues. We have Dr. Ibru from Oceanic Bank International PLC to raise some questions around the business environment in Africa and how governments can make it more enabling. She's at table number 2. And last but not least, we have Chris Gabriel, who's the CEO of Zain Africa, obviously for this all-important question of technology, innovation, and telecoms. I'd like to call on Dr. Salim Ahmed Salim from the 50 drivers of change that have been identified by the public, the discussion you've had at your table, anything that we've missed out on. Give us your sense on where you think leaders at the World Economic Forum Africa should be prioritizing. Here you go. Yes, there's a microphone there for you.
Well, we had, let me first say we had a democratic discussion here, and we chose our spokesperson here. And I was hoping that he will be speaking. I don't have to say anything.
I'm not that democratic.
But we have gone through the various items or issues enumerated in this list. We have come to, we have selected 3. One is transparency and accountability. And I'd like to say something about transparency and accountability. We define transparency and accountability in a much broader manner, which means it also involves the whole question of the fight against corruption, the whole question of good governance, and so on. We talk about infrastructure, and infrastructure is critical given the current situation where really, as a result of the global recession, it's going to affect Africa a lot. in the area of unemployment. So infrastructure will not only help in terms of unemployment, but basically it will also make things possible as far as Africa's efforts, for example, in search for food security. The experience in the continent, or at least some parts of the continent, and especially in the country I come from, is that you may have a situation where there's a lot of food being produced in a given area, but it's extremely difficult to transport that food from that particular area to other areas of need. So the consequences are you end up importing food all the way, say, from Asia or from elsewhere, and while food is available. So if you have proper roads and proper networking, then it makes a difference. And also we have the question of women empowerment, and we have also added the importance of, within the context of this empowerment, to empower people with disabilities. Now, the issue of disabilities does not feature here, but we feel the question of disability should be included in the list, especially if you take into account the reality in the continent where a lot of people, young people, elderly people are disabled and they do not have access to many facilities which are essential. Finally, the question of skills and education. This is also, I think, is self-evident. Now, I want to say something about governance. We are passing through an extremely difficult situation right now in the continent. Things were much better last year. The statistics are very clear, the data is there. Last year alone, for example, Africa's growth was 6%. This year it is expected to go to 2%. Last year, about $20 billion constituted remittances from abroad. This year is going to go down. So the question also of the whole question of external resources, the official development assistance, the FDI, and so on. All these are going to go down because of the situation. But I want to say this, that even if we continue to have all this assistance, Africa's progress will be severely impaired and severely hampered if we don't get the question of governance in its proper perspective, if we don't take the question of corruption seriously. We've been discussing here about corruption. And really, corruption at the various levels, at the business level, at the political level, it is something which creates a tremendous threat to this continent's development. And I know, when I say corruption, it's very important. It's not only Africans who are corrupted. It's very important to bear that in mind. Because in every corruption, there is corruptors and corruptees. So Africans, in some of our institutions, we become victims of our corruptees. But some of our friends in the North, some of our developed partners, they are the actual corruptors also. So the fight against corruption must be universally fought. And we feel here that as we talk about what will happen between now and next year, I think if we take the question of governance seriously, if we take the question of fighting corruption seriously, and we also concentrate on some of these areas of skills development, infrastructure, and so on, it will make a difference.
Okay, the journalist in me can't allow you to get off on that one. Governance, transparency, and accountability you've raised as critical and priority areas. Just drawing on your experience at the helm of the OAU, for instance, many people would say, why is it where in 2009, we're in the era of the NEPAD and so many other governance standards that have come to the fore, and yet corruption and governance continue to be problems in Africa? There's something wrong systemically. There's something wrong by way of the psychosis of African leadership, where we can't hold our leaders accountable, either because we're too afraid or we don't understand what constitutionality means, or we have leaders who just don't care. Where does it begin to establish that accountability?
It's a combination. To begin with, I think it's important to bear in mind that things have changed in this continent. Yes, I've talked about corruption, I've talked about governance, but it's not true that all African countries are corrupt, or all governments, all leaders are corrupt. There are some who are corrupt. The institutions, and in some cases also, the institutions are weak. So there has been effort, serious effort being made, and especially with the involvement, with the growing involvement of the civil society, things have begun to change. People now, the truth is, people now no longer accept as facts or as given when leaders, loot or when leaders, instead of focusing on developmental issues, they go on, externalizing their funds to Geneva or to London and elsewhere. So there is a sea change. But yes, there is still a problem, and I think this is a problem which has to be tackled by every African. It's not simply a question of institutions, it's not simply a question of leaders, it's a question of the sensitization of the ordinary Africans. I think the minute the Africans themselves say, we are no longer going to accept this situation, we are no longer going to allow leaders who can simply decide that they can remain in power in perpetuity, irrespective of the system, irrespective of the constitution of the country, then things will begin to change. And I'm convinced that that is happening. It's moving much slower than many of us would like to see, but I think the process is moving, and especially because of internal pressures. Yes, there's an external dimension, but to be very frank, our friends in the West, our friends in the North have been very helpful. They support us, they talk about good governance and so on. But some of their own actions do not create the best impression. So it becomes difficult. So I think we should depend more on our own forces. We should depend on Africans putting pressure on their governments for change. Okay. Africans to have governments which are accountable and are transparent.
All right, I'd like to bring in Bekele Geleta, Secretary General of the Red Cross, just from the issues that have been brought to the fore as the 50 key challenges, those identified in your discussion group and out on.
Well, thank you. The group here came up with 3 priorities, if you like: affordable technology, water management, visionary leadership. Now, I take the 3 last words: technology, management, and leadership. This is extremely important. Now, technology, because they have to have the means to do what they want to do, and it has to be affordable. Management, because African people should know how to manage their scarce resources. In this case, they have identified water. There are many other scarce resources, but management is extremely important. If that is introduced at the level of water, it can be used in many other areas as well. Leadership, because leadership, visionary leadership, if there is good leadership, most of the problems that have been identified within the tag could be very easily dealt with. Corruption, transparency, accountability, rule of law, etc. If there is leadership, the problem is really half solved. Now, therefore, Africa, I mean, when I see these 3, I see that Africa is moving from despair to hope. Africa is moving into confidence of doing what they want to do themselves rather than looking outside, and the commitment to make change also. They want technology to change, and then management to change, and leadership to change as well. I thought the 3 things that are identified by this group is really outstanding. Now, from the humanitarian side, I mean, this is extremely important for us, because we deal with people. Now, people that need hope. Now, people that need to be empowered. Now, we work on disasters, we work on structural vulnerability to help people to care for their own lives, to be responsible for their own lives. In terms of immediate priorities in Africa in the next 1-2 years, food security becomes extremely important in terms of availability, in terms of access, and in terms of the use of food. This is extremely important. And then one more thing that is extremely important is dealing with climate change, both adaptation and mitigation. Now, climate change is impacting the severity of the frequency and the severity of disasters. There are many disasters that are hitting Africa, especially the slow onset disasters such as droughts and floods. Right. So we really need to work on food security as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Chris, Gabriel, can I draw you into this conversation, because the issue of technology is coming up again and again, innovation. and that being linked to the ability to enhance productivity, and as we saw in the YouTube submissions, by introducing technology into the skill set, you'll really be making African students a lot more competitive and empowered.
Very much so. I mean, if we look at some of the innovation that is out there now, mobile money transfer, ultra low-cost handsets, very, very cheap laptops, sub-$100 laptops, and we look at further things that are coming, One Network. What we're doing is providing a communications and a technology vehicle to all people of Africa. Now, that is not just to the urban areas, but also to the rural and remote areas. And one example I can give you is we're out at a very, very remote village in Kenya called Dirtu. It's about 100 kilometres north of Garissa. And we turned up telecommunications there for the first time. We put a mobile base station with solar power there. And the first phone call was made that absolutely moved the community. The girl was crying when she made the first phone call. And I came back to that village 3 months after, and the village elder, as soon as he saw me, he came running up to me and he said, "Mr. Chris, I now know how much a bull costs in Garissa." Now, to us, many of us from the Western world, that may not mean much. But to him, what that meant was he didn't have to traverse 2 days to get to that market to find out that the price wasn't there, to go to another market for 2 days, to come back to his same market. So spending a week traversing, in 30 seconds, he knew how much the price of the bull was, and he could optimize his business. In the space of 3 months, we had 22,000 call attempts every week and over 1,000 unique customers. That's just one example. Other examples, Lake Victoria, introducing mobile coverage in Lake Victoria, 20 kilometres into the shore. When the fishermen go out, they can find out what's happening in the weather. If they get into difficulties, they can call in, and they can ring the markets to find out what is in demand and optimise the price of their catch. So mobile telephony and technology is there for the taking. And I think from the earlier discussions we had over the last 2 days, I think the technology is there. And as I said, and we discussed in the group here, I think all of the answers are in this room. We all know what the questions are. We all know what the answers are. And it really takes some collaboration and some leadership for somebody to take the first step, not just a small step, but a gigantic step, and lead by example. And the enabling technology is there. All we need is somebody to be really brave and do something big.
I was walking around trying to establish how far along each table was in voting for the top drivers. A conversation that was happening in little snippets was one on gender parity. And table number 5 has raised it as an issue that is not addressed comprehensively in the 50 challenges we've identified, but it's something we need to discuss. Why is that, table 5?
Right. We felt very, very strongly that the issue of gender parity wasn't addressed clearly enough by the nearest match, which was women empowerment. Around this table, we felt strongly that there is an issue of optimization of resources, of human resources in Africa that is not being addressed properly. And we see gender parity as an issue that really is the source of many social and economic dysfunctionalities within the societies of our continent. So we really wanted to bring that up and make a very, very big point that it should be addressed.
I think at table 22 is where the debate on gender parity was hotting up, and we were dealing with semantics and what do we mean by empowerment, what do we mean by parity. The fact is, the majority of Africa's people are women. 40% of economically Africans are women, the majority of them being in the informal sector. The face of poverty, the face of disease, the victims of conflict are women. We have gender parity ratios outlined by the AU, and yet most African governments failing to meet those requirements. What do you think the problems are? Table 22.
I think the problem here is about education. Many women have, when you look into agriculture and rural areas, you find out that the continent is being fed by women. And they are fed by women, but they don't have the technology to be able to feed the continent. And I think this brings another link between hunger and women empowerment. And also, excuse me, yeah. And also, the women are doing this without resources. They have no access to resources, they have no access to credit, they have no access to education. And we really believe that if the continent wants to improve, there is half of the resources which are not used properly, and this is time really to emphasize on it and put it as an agenda. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. Obviously, we're living in a world of global recession. The IMF has reforecast growth for Africa. Optimistically, last year, we're expecting Africa to grow at an average of about 6%. Now we're looking at 1 to 2%. As the challenges mount, there's the additional challenge of Western markets increasingly being protected through various government legislation. And that's within a context of access of goods into the EU and to the United States already having been difficult, and hence the stalling of the Doha round of trade talks. So a challenge that's been identified as a new and additional challenge to be debated at WEF is new protectionism raised by Table 17. It's a question that was interrogated at the G20, and it's something to which we still don't have any answers. And linking this issue of new protectionism is, what are we going to do about Africa's youth? They constitute the majority of the population. They are most vulnerable right now, coming out of school without an available job, without the necessary skills to enter the job market. When economies contract, become increasingly protected, we have this constituency that's going to be left out. So Table 17, can you tell us what you mean by new protectionism? And then can we start also debating issues around youth entrepreneurship as well?
Thank you. It's really, for us, it was drilling down on that very question: how do you level the playing field? And just to pull in, we weren't talking as much about the youth, but just to pull them in, we know that we have such a young population. And in terms of skills development that's necessary, in terms of also the trade issues. In fact, Mike, you want to talk about the trade issues we talked about?
I think what we're really saying is, from a perspective of protectionism, it is not necessarily the barriers, it's also the subsidies that we're trying to compete with outside of Africa. And I think one of the first steps is also to look at how we can promote, through the mechanisms of protectionism, trade within Africa. We really need to grow the trade, Africa trade in Africa. And especially in the current economic climate that is there.
All right, does anybody want to add to this issue of protectionism? Because it's happening even within SADC, for instance, where we see South Africa, lo and behold, my country, bullying the smaller members of SACU into not signing economic partnership agreements with the European Union. Just a statement. Table number 4. Would you like to add your voice to the issue of the youth and what can be done to empower the youth, because they are the most vulnerable at this stage?
Yes, we talked about youth engagement and empowerment, because we felt that if you don't engage young people in development discussion, development planning, development implementation on the continent, there will be no sustainable growth. And if you don't engage them in political processes as well, especially at the African Union and within the regional economic blocs, if they're not well informed and well empowered to to be part of this process, there would be no growth. So this is why we, in our group, we felt that if you don't engage young people, it's a new issue amongst the 50 items that you tabled out. And we figured that we need to address the issue of young people being part of the development process on the continent.
All right, I'd like to raise your attention to new issues that have made it onto the broader tag cloud, but that hadn't featured quite prominently in public conversation, but the public feels really need to be addressed here. The question of the Niger Delta. Nigeria is Africa's most populous nation, and from the many investment bankers I've spoken to on my television program, they insist that within 5 years' time, it will be the economic giant of Africa, surpassing South Africa by growth rate and rates of return. So when such a promising country has its budget deferred many times because the oil price has fluctuated, because over 80% of foreign revenues depend on oil, because production has been cut due to ongoing conflict in the Niger Delta. What does it mean, not just for Nigeria and the role it plays in West Africa, but for African growth in general? Is there somebody who'd like to help us shed some light on this one?
Thank you very much. My name's Mazi Sam Ohuabungwa, the chairman of the Nigerian Economic Summit Group. I think that the question you've asked is so germane. When we saw it on our list of issues here, we felt that it's a problem that, even though it's a national, it seems to be a national issue, does have a bigger problem for Africa. I think that the question you've asked can be looked at from two different ways. First is, how do you deal with internal conflicts? In every nation, in every community, there are bound to come a time when there are disagreements, either how national patrimony should be organized or how the issue of contribution and distribution should be dealt with. I think it's a problem that has occurred in Africa and has led to wars and all kinds of disruptions. The Nigerian case is one, and it's an issue that is burgeoning and has the potential to cause a disruption. The 2009 budget of the Nigerian government, a large proportion of it is not funded, deficit, and the reduction in the oil income is a key issue. I believe that the challenge here is for Nigeria to try and get its act together and resolve this problem, because if Nigeria is unable to meet its needs, the budget needs, dealing with the issues of the people, then someday it will affect the neighboring states, given the overriding position of Nigeria in Africa, especially in West Africa. So it's something that calls for diplomacy and using the best of carrot and stick. Now, the other side, beyond the issue of conflict, is trying to understand how economies need to be diversified. Nigeria represents, maybe to some extent, what happens in a lot of African countries that depend on primary commodities. And anytime there is some challenge in consumption of those commodities overseas, the economies immediately begin to panic. In September, October last year, Nigeria was doing very well, having 16 billion reserves. But just 2-3 months after that, because the prices of commodities collapsed, Nigeria was beginning to get into some crisis, financial crisis. I think it's a challenge for African nations to see how we can diversify economies, especially bring in agro-industries, bring in value creation and value addition. We cannot grow and deal with poverty until we're doing a lot more value creation than just having primary products. Thank you.
All right, we're ready to wrap this part of the discussion up. We will continue after we've had a look at how you voted as leaders at the World Economic Forum. Is it going to come up on the screen? Okay, the bigger words, the bigger font, the bigger words, shows what have been identified as the 3 drivers by yourselves. So education, infrastructure, good governance, and to some extent water management. Let's talk about this issue of infrastructure, and I'd like to invite our fourth discussant, Dr. Ebru from Oceanic Bank in Nigeria, to talk to us about the implications of poor infrastructure, which we know for African growth and development. It could improve productivity by 40% if there was sufficient investment in that area. Do you have a microphone, ma'am? Not at all. Here she is.
Thank you. Before I start my intervention, I'd just like to say that on the table here, we had 2 more aspects added. It might not be relevant now, but I think I should mention. We voted for visionary leadership, rule of law, education, financial literacy, and culture. These are 2 others we added because we feel they could not be left out. Since we've made a vote on the others, I will just comment on financial literacy and culture before I go on to my intervention. Financial literacy we find in Africa. Many of us enter into relationship with external bodies, FDIs, but we don't understand the financial implications. Then down the road, we begin to see that we have to pay for things we didn't really receive. And this, I think, pervades the whole of Africa, and then take it further down. Even us in Africa, we don't understand financial literacy, how money moves, the nature of relationship between money movement and so on and so forth. Then the other aspect we added was culture. We in Africa, we are being treated as a homogeneous group, but we are not. We have different cultures. And I don't think you can talk about Africa without accepting that we have different cultures, and therefore we will react to different stimuli different ways. And I think we should take that into account too. Thank you very much. Now I'll go into my intervention. That is the public-private sector partnership, especially in the area of infrastructure. I feel that infrastructure is so important in any growth economy or growing economy or even developed economy. In Africa, we find we don't have roads, we don't have different types of roads, be it ordinary road, railways, or even air traffic. For instance, if you want to go from Lagos to, say, the East Coast, you might have to go to Paris or London or wherever before you come down by air. And then, of course, the roads that would ordinarily link Africa together would not be there. We don't even have them in our individual countries, let alone linkages. And also, we find that when we talk about infrastructure, it's not just the roads network, it's not education is part of it, energy is part of it, water is part of it. And many of us still watch Africans going to muddy waters to fetch water on CNN. And I think that's something that we all should be ashamed of. Because I feel that the water problem is not peculiar to Africa, but we Africans have done nothing about it. And this is something to do also with what we discussed here, visionary leadership. What is good for our people? And we have seen what has happened in Dubai. through just one person buying into a new vision to bring Dubai into a world-class economy.
Right.
We also saw what has happened in Singapore. And these two are good examples for us to study and see how they have done it, because they were also in this level of development about 20 years ago. And with that, I would like to just conclude that we can do it once we set our mind to it.
Right.
In the area of PPP, we have now found that the private sector partnering with governments, we are able to come up with solutions. In Lagos, for instance, we are beginning to have our own airport that was built through a PPP intervention. And we have also seen in roads that were very bad, we are now seeing that we can do it through concessions.
Right.
And the proposition here is that there's money to be made in that kind of partnership that will excite business people. And before I stop, I just want to add that African assets has no class. They only are, the West will only invest into them for speculative reasons. And we need to understand that our type of assets are different from the Western assets and should be given a particular grade so that people will look at our proposition more seriously rather than from a speculative point of view and not invest. There's plenty of money in the West, there's plenty of money in the East. What happened in the subprime and in the meltdown, we feel in Africa, that money should have been brought to Africa to develop Africa, not to be funding assets that were non-existent.
All right, I think let's bring in Dr. Nkosana Moyo into this conversation. Your perspective on what have been identified by leaders here as key challenges: education, skills, infrastructure, governance.
We actually had a couple of conversations. We went through the exercise that you asked us to undertake and made sure that we dispensed with that. And in that exercise, we identified poverty reduction, technology and education and infrastructure, so quite consistent with everybody else. But I believe we then went into a much more challenging conversation. We proposed that these lists are more to do with symptoms and tools that we should be using to achieve something else. And our proposal was that human activity should be anchored on a value system, guided by rules and regulations, and then we've got the activities which are listed here as the drivers, but actually they are just activities. And what is tended to happen is a rattling between the second and third of those items. In other words, rules and regulations and activity, but completely unguided by a value system. And we believe that we actually ought to be going back to the basics and finding that anchor. What is the value system? Why do we do what we do? How do we relate to each other? When we talk about corruption, leadership without any vision, we believe it's fundamentally because the value system has been chucked overboard and nobody is revisiting that. And these conversations are staying at the second and third levels rather than going back to the fundamentals. Right. That's really our basis.
No, don't take away the microphone. I'd like you to elaborate a little bit more, because when you look at the World Bank's report on doing business in Africa, African countries don't feature very prominently, and when they do, they start coming in at number 34, 50, 70. Some are just not even on the radar. And I think it's an indictment on the environment of doing business in Africa, is that even when you do introduce the necessary rules and regulation, there's still so much bureaucracy. You know, in countries like Angola, we've been told that just to make corporate tax submissions could take you up to 3 years. Just to set up a business, to get the permit, is about 9 months. These are the bottlenecks that business wants addressed so that there are efficiencies and incentives.
You know, again, let me just go back. There is a conversation I had this morning. I participated in a different forum where it was suggested that Africa has got an opportunity to decouple from the value system set in the West, because even the economic model maybe is just being proven not to be that sound after all. But again, the argument was maybe the issue is not so much about this activity. We're mad about activity, running around trying to create more and more things.
But maybe Africa's value systems would create an alternative on an economic model which is based much more on, you know, in Southern Africa there is an expression, umuntu ngumuntu ngabantu. Those who don't understand that is a human being's definition of who he or she is derived from relationships with other people. That's really what it fundamentally means. But in the economic model we're using, we value things and volumes almost purposelessly. So I suppose what we're suggesting is that let's just take a step back. Let's stop running so fast and just try to create a purpose as to why we're doing the things we're doing.
All right, Emma, if you can help me, we'd like to just tell you about what sort of sessions you can expect here at the World Economic Forum, just for that to coalesce with the views that you've raised here, issues that may interest you. All right, so for all of you who really believe that jobs and skills and unemployment is something that needs to be addressed at this forum, there is a session today, the 10th of June, at 1500 hours 30 minutes, so 3:30 in room 3A. That's where the issue will be tackled more comprehensively. For those who are concerned about questions of a vibrant private sector and developing and nurturing this entrepreneurial spirit, and I think within that is the issue of youth empowerment, there is a session on June 12th, which is Friday morning, at 9 o'clock in the morning, 9 a.m. in room 1. Water management is going to be tackled in a session titled Water, a Key to Unblocking Growth. That will happen tomorrow, June 11th at 10:30 a.m. in room 1. The issue of infrastructure and removing bottlenecks is going to be addressed in a session taking place on June 11th, tomorrow, at 2 p.m. in room 3A. June 11th, 2 p.m., room 3A. And of course, the favorite, corruption and good governance. A call for a change in leadership will be addressed at the Cullinan Hotel at 7:30 p.m. today. 7:30 p.m., Cullinan Hotel, corruption and governance. And of course, because I'm standing here, I can just take the liberty to say, CNBC Africa will be hosting a debate tomorrow at 1 o'clock in the afternoon titled Repricing Africa's Risk. So investors who want to know about the challenges of doing business in Africa at a time of slowed growth, at a time when credit lines have dried up, at a time when leaders are challenged to be more accountable, please join us in this ballroom tomorrow at 1 o'clock, where we'll be speaking to an esteemed panel tackling this pressing question of risks of investment in Africa and how to reprice those risks. I'd like to thank you for your time. I'd like to thank you for interrogating some key issues: education, infrastructure, governance. Please make sure you raise them in the various sessions and panel discussions that you're participating in. Thank you, Salim Ahmed Salim. Thank you, Dr. Nkosana Moyo. Thank you, Bekele Geleta. Thank you, Dr. Ibru. And thank you, Chris Gabriel, for sharing with us your insights. And I wish you a wonderful World Economic Forum Africa.